Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about generative AI and how companies can protect themselves against the challenges of generative AI, even as they explore the enormous upside of this emerging technology. To discuss that, I'm joined by Aaron Kalb, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Alation. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today.
James, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Certainly a hot topic. Is it not generative AI? Is anyone talking about anything else these days?
It seems like they're not. And normally when this happens, I get very frustrated. I was so exhausted by all the talk about crypto for the longest time.
Right.
Finally, a topic that I think may actually be worthy of all the buzz. I guess we'll see.
What about cloud computing? Do you remember anyone people when people used to talk about this thing called cloud computing?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is the cloud. I think at the end of the day, for the end user was not necessarily the most relevant. It's kind of like, oh, my car has an amazing new engine. I'm glad my ride is smoother or my gas mileage is better, or that I don't need gas at all because it's electric. But at the end of the day, I just want to get where I want to go. I think what's
Right.
interesting about AI is it isn't just CIOs who are excited. It's everyone and their kids can kind of relate in some way to ChatGPT or Dolly or some of this accessible technology.
So very true. ChatGPT and generative AI has really captured the interest of consumer public and businesses. So the question is, of course, for businesses, the stakes are a lot higher. So the real question is, how can enterprises ensure accuracy and otherwise guard against some of the problems involved with generative AI? What do you see in this area?
Yeah, 100% right. I think a lot of the applications of generative AI that have seized the public imagination are these kind of fun consumer use cases where you ask ChatGPT to, read Steve Jobs' speech as though it was written by Shakespeare or something. These kind
Right,
of
right.
mixing some crossovers and asking it for life advice, which is like sometimes really good, and when it's not good, it's really funny. And
Well,
of course,
it's on that same note, I once asked ChatGPT what the meaning of life is. And it came up with a surprisingly cogent answer about how individual values and choice. And it's like, wow, that was as good as some of those cheap self-help books I've read.
well, totally, and probably the GPT models have read those cheap self-help books and
Yes.
all the blogs and all the everything in the public domain, and so it in some ways not as surprising as it sometimes seems that it can parrot back the best of human wisdom or human
Cliches.
cliche or what have you. I
Yeah.
think the thing about consumer that's different, as you alluded to, is when it gets it right in the consumer case, it's delightful. When it gets it wrong in the consumer case, it's sort of humorous. And you can kind of have a bit of a selection bias, that sort of thing, and it's okay. When you get to an enterprise context, there are certain enterprise contexts where maybe that's totally fine, but in many of them, the stakes are much higher. The cost of a mistake could cause really bad consequences or minimally could undermine the trust of your users or your customers. And so I do
Right.
think a lot of excitement in the enterprise, but a good deal more caution maybe than we see in the consumer space. And I don't think that's a reason to dismiss the technology or to avoid it, but I think it is a reason to kind of build it into processes that involve AI, generative AI, other forms of AI and ML automation, and manual human involvement by different types of humans, by experts, by different stakeholders to ensure that the eventual output is appropriate to the task at hand.
Well, I'm going to guess that's easier said than done. And that I think, of the many problems, one of them, of course, is that data of confidential information. Like there's one company who will remain nameless where the person entered some sensitive code into the generative AI program. And like suddenly that was part of the larger database and that sensitive material was quote unquote given away. And like that was a problem. So it's a slippery slope. I mean, if there's a series of managers out there who are looking to guard against it, what might you say? Like, here's some ways to put some guardrails in place.
100%. I think there's two aspects to it. One is the particular implementation or deployment that's being used. Certainly, if we're using one of these third-party cloud APIs and we're sending data from within our firewall out to it and hoping for the best, minimally you want to use one of the services that sort of promises not to integrate the data you send into their training model.
Uh-huh.
And then you have to hope that if they say that they're going to hold to it and they're not going to be hacked. And we can all read the headlines about all the ways that's going to go wrong.
Right.
But I think even if you have your own LLM or a super trusted, secure one, even then there's this risk that, yeah, maybe the training data isn't leaked, but maybe the output is untrustworthy. So I think one key thing to do is to consider the use case. So an example that I like, many people have thought, hey, writing isn't the most fun, or is kind of time consuming. Maybe I can save a bunch of time by having GPT-3, GPT-4 do all my writing for me.
Sure.
I think the desire for cost savings is understandable and actually definitely possible. And the paradigm I recommend in that case is what I call sort of the GPT sandwich with human bread, right? So you might think, I have 5 different ideas for articles, and for each one, I could write them in 6 different ways. And you could just write 30 one-sentence prompts and have GPT write, multiple thousand-word articles for each of them.
Right.
And then you, hey, rewrite this with punchier prose, or rewrite that more formally, or all this stuff is much easier to have the computer do a first pass on than to have to do it all yourself. But the key is to then follow it up with that human step where you read every sentence. You can't just say, hey, GPT, can you summarize what you just wrote? I'll read the summary. Check and make sure there aren't hallucinations, there aren't inaccuracies, it's in your voice. I think if you do that, you can, again, get that kind of creativity by proxy, save a lot of time. But if you skip that last step and get, a little bit, lazy, as it were, then I think there's a huge risk of something really embarrassing happening, or worse, depending on where that text is going, as one example.
Really interesting. So, I mean, I think you may have talked about this. Then you've said at one point that generative AI models still need to balance innovation with human touch. So you mean that sort of the ChatGPT sandwich idea kind of idea? How else can they balance the human touch? Because it seems like it's clearly needed.
Yeah, I think absolutely. So one case is just making sure that whatever the generative model produces, a human reviews before it goes out. And again, easier said than done. You can see the temptation to say, oh, I want to have GPT write an email to all of my 100 million users,
Right.
telling them, a personalized message about how much we love the way they've been using the product and how we want them to come back. That might be tempting, but I would argue that in that case, you're probably better off having your copywriting team make a template and filling in the user's name and an example of a thing they bought recently or did recently, and like one other little thing, in more of a Mad Lib that's much more constrained, because the creativity of GPT without a human in the loop, may be more trouble than it's worth. You might want to have more control and have automation is a little bit less random. I think there's other ways humans can be in the loop too. One of them is just having an intelligent, thoughtful human design the prompt, design the interface, design the process in which the AI is embedded. I see, unfortunately, some human beings acting like they're robots and just sticking, generative AI into places it doesn't belong without thinking about it. So in some ways, part of being a human is to leverage your humanity and the context you have about the world and how it works and what your users want, and having empathy. Instead of just blindly using it. So there's a lot of manifestations of where sort of that human balance can come in. I think the other key point is, a model is only as good as the data that goes into it.
Right.
And yes, it's true that if, the internet, most things on the internet today were written by humans. One day that's not going to be true anymore, one day soon probably, but for now. But I think it's important to say, okay, what training data do we put in? If we train these models on the most racist, xenophobic, illiterate parts of the internet, we're going to get output we really don't like. And so part of it is that human judgment and putting the right data in. And in an enterprise context, we're not talking about the public internet, I think finding the right data as input becomes a huge challenge. I think very often, if you put in stale data or inaccurate data or just the wrong data in any way, you're going to get garbage in, garbage out. And the stakes are so much higher when the AI has more autonomy.
Well, on that note, I mean, you referenced earlier about, if a company has its own large language model. Do you think most companies have their own large language model? I'm gonna guess the answer is no to that. But what is your take on that?
I think it's interesting to see how this develops. One hypothesis that I have is, in the same way that AWS and then later Azure and Google Cloud, platform, made sort of, elastic, internet hosting and all the other cloud services available to the masses. I think we will see a similar thing emerge, where there'll be not one, the way there might seem to be today. No, already that's changing, but there'll be a handful of large and a long tail of small players that offer, different generic but customizable, fine-tunable, parametric, settings.
For large language models. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in the same way that everyone has their AWS cluster or their GPC cluster or their Azure cluster, everyone's going to have their large language model, but only a few players that are very technical and have very particular needs and have the means to do so will actually roll their own, and the rest will use a service. But I think we will see some people doing their own in places like defense and certain places where it's like highly regulatory. I think in certain parts of financial services where you need to have a certain level of speed that you can't afford to have the round trip to a third party. And I think there will be vendors who will offer, on-premise models where, it is more an enterprise's own model than the cloud case, but isn't built from scratch. We'll see that a lot more as well, I think.
Well, it seems like it's going to be a major competitive advantage to truly roll your own customized, bespoke large language model, as opposed to those folks that are using kind of a generic one that's been dressed up and tweaked for them. Behind the scenes, it's going to give a big advantage to those custom folks, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a mix of learning and unlearning that has to happen. So I think if your use case really relies on that apparent linguistic intelligence of like seeming to really understand what a human is saying and produce, human, thoughtful, natural sounding response. And we're focused very much now on the text case. There's obviously other applications of Gen AI, but
Sure.
in that case, I think the bigger the core language model is, the better. And so you might want to fine tune it with some proprietary data in your system, but something that is trained on as big a swath of human knowledge and human text as possible can be an advantage. There are other cases, though, where the breadth of these models is actually a bug, not a feature, right? Where you don't want it to have read all the travel blogs and recipes and social media accounts. You want something that only knows about investing or only knows about retail or what have you. And in those cases, actually, a much smaller model could not only be cheaper, easier to maintain, whatnot, but actually also more reliable and dependable because it doesn't have as much to hallucinate about. So I think it depends on the use case, whether folks will want to take a big model and fine tune it, or whether they'll actually want to build their own, from scratch, as it were, or using one of these toolkits that I think will increasingly be available.
Makes perfect sense. All right, so let's drill down to the role that Alation plays. So we're in this new world of generative AI. It is a data hungry world, to be sure. How does Alation move this world forward?
100%. So I think there's two ways Alation thinks about Gen AI and AI in general. Excuse me. So the first thing is almost every use of data. I mean, really every use of data. Apologies, sorry, clear my throat. Basically, every use of data is garbage in, garbage out. And I think, for the last several years, we've mostly seen people using data for the purposes of analytics and business intelligence. And so that's garbage in, garbage out. But the nice news is there's sort of a human in the loop. So if I'm a person and I use, for example, Alation to discover a data set, to do some analysis about my customer base or my supply chain or whatever it is, and if I'm using Alation, I'm going to get the right data because Alation will help me understand, okay, this is the data that's most used. Here's the data that's trusted for its use case, et cetera. But in the absence of a data catalog or a data intelligence tool, I might ask somebody what data to use. I might pick a table that appears to have the right name for my use case, and I might be wrong about that data's applicability, quality, relevance, et cetera. And if I use bad data, I'll get this bad result in my dashboard or this bad Excel file or whatever comes out of it. And the hope is that because I know my business, I'll say, you know what, that doesn't look right. We don't have that many customers, or our supply chain isn't that distributed, or whatever the clue is.
Right.
And so AI is just like BI, and that if you have bad data going in, you have bad decisions, bad indications coming out. But the problem is, at its best, the human is less in the loop. You get that lift when the automation is able to have some autonomy and go quickly. And so I think it's the same universe of needing to get trusted data, but the stakes are even higher, and it's even more scary to imagine it going wrong. And so software like Alation that, again, can help you discover relevant data, distinguish the good data from the bad data, is all the more vital. I think the other thing to consider is software like Alation also doesn't just enable AI, but also really benefits from AI. From the very beginning, we've had AI built into our product using ML and different kinds of AI to, figure out what data is useful for this case, automatically figure out what data can be trusted, all that sort of thing. And I think as we fold more and more generative AI into our product, we're going to see even more of those advantages of automation and intelligence be bestowed upon our customers and users.
So really, it's a system that is at least partially powered by AI helping to create artificial intelligence itself. I guess that's not a totally new idea. I never fully realized that idea. Of course, that's the way it has to be. There's no way around that.
I think that's true, and I think the one key point is it's a loop, a virtuous cycle of AI to AI, but
Right.
with it, junctions, the right humans in place. What we want to do is we want to eliminate human toil, all the copy, paste, transcribe from paper onto the computer, like all of those tasks that, are just, boring and mundane and don't require judgment. And actually, in certain of these tasks, a human is more error prone than a computer. That's a great place to bring in AI and free humans up. But if we jump too far ahead and take humans out entirely, there's this fear of a snake eating its own tail. Like it just says, hey, AI, grab whatever data looks right to you, and then come to whatever conclusions you want to come to and take whatever action you want to take. That's when we get these like Terminator, sci-fi, terrifying scenarios. But with Alation, the idea is, the computer makes the job of data documentation, data curation, data discovery easier. It doesn't do it all for the human, it makes it easier. And then you're going to have AI systems that get great results that then get augmented.
What is the human role then in that process? Is it making judgments about what chunk of data is going to go where? What does the human do?
That's exactly right. So let's suppose I'm an AI engineer, or I'm fine tuning or building my own model for a company, and I have to say, okay, what data are we going to train on, right? If let's say this model is going to be a chatbot that talks to customers dynamically about their about their customer service issues, and then routes to a human only when it's the hardest problems, but it's kind of a first line of defense that solves the early things quickly. So I want this this bot to kind of have at its metaphorical fingertips what a good customer service rep would have. Like, okay, how long has this customer been with the company? What were their recent purchases? Was there a delay? Is that why they're angry? Like all that sort of content. You might want to feed all that into the model. Well, your database might have tens of thousands of columns with different bits of customer or user data, and you need to create the right training data set. Or even just like on a per prompt basis, if you're prompt engineering, or there's many different applications in an AI engineering context, but you want to get the right data to get the right outcome. And each one of those decisions, if you don't have a data intelligence tool like Alation, it's quite probable that it'll put in the wrong data and then produce a bot that causes more harm than good.
All right, makes perfect sense. So the big question is what's going to happen in the future. If you look a few years down the road, the future of generative AI, and I think that sometimes people forget it's not new totally in enterprise, but it's new in the public consciousness since the end of 2022. So of course it still hallucinates, still has some problems, but of course it's so new. A lot of these problems are going to be solved, and then what happens? What do you see happening? A few years in the future of generative AI and the enterprise?
And
no one can predict this. If you could really predict it, you'd be on a beach in Tahiti right now. But still, I'm asking you anyways.
That's right, exactly. I'm hesitant to say it because it is moving so quickly. I'll say one thing that I do know, however, is the models will absolutely improve, but there's certain barriers, I'll say, or challenges where more intelligence alone can't solve it. So one reason I'm very bullish about the space Alation is in is no matter how intelligent you are, whether you're artificial intelligent or human intelligent, intelligence alone cannot substitute for knowledge. Right. I might be able to write the most brilliant algorithm or do the most brilliant analysis in the world, but if I'm wrong about the facts, I'm going to draw the wrong conclusions, even if I'm infinitely intelligent. And so I think always going to be a role for data and thinking about data quality and data governance and data discovery, because no matter how smart the systems get, in fact, the smarter they get, the more vital it is that they are correct about what's true and what's false, because they're going to run wild and be increasingly empowered with whatever they have. That being said, I'm happy to speculate a little bit.
Oh, good.
I think I think we're going to see AI. One thing we're going to see is like designers and developers get better and better. We're going to get more like AI Legos, if you will, and AI SDKs and AI frameworks. And there'll be books written about designing with AI and about, policy and process with AI. And so we're going to see, I think, instead of this kind of wild west of AI that's dangerous, people trust it too much, people don't trust it enough. I think we're going to see some, kind of like with mobile devices or with the internet or whatever, we're going to get to see some paradigms that enable us to integrate AI intelligently into all aspects of life. And it's going to be really great in some domains. I think we're also going to see some weird 2 steps forward, 1 step back phenomena. One thing, and there's experts who disagree on this, but I am actually quite concerned that as the internet gets filled up with content written by these bots, much of which looks great, some of which is great, some of which is actually terrible and wrong and quirky. That we're going to have this sort of snake eating its own tail phenomenon, where either you stop training on the new data and then everything is stale by 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or you keep learning new things, but a lot of it is you're kind of reading your own garbage.
Right. So it's actually training. Its own bias is being reinforced because it keeps rereading it.
That's right. And so in the same way, something like personal computing or the internet, creates all this incredible opportunity, but then creates these problems we didn't expect. I think, and obviously I don't know what I don't know what to expect. One thing I do expect is a whole industry about this problem we have today about fake news and trust and whatnot is about to get even worse. I picture a whole industry dedicated to helping you as a consumer decide what parts of the information out there were actually, if not written by a human, at least verified or validated by a human.
Sure.
And by the way, not just so that you can trust it as a human, but not only are AI is going to be doing so much writing, they're going to be doing so much reading. I mean, probably a few years from now, no one's going to read their email. They're just going to have their intelligent assistant say, "Good morning, sir. Good morning, madam. Here's what's important out of the millions of emails that I read, most of which were written by other AIs." I mean, it's going to get dystopian, I think, in certain areas.
It is dystopian. Yeah. It used to be like my people will call your people. Now it's like my bot will call your bot.
I think so. I mean, some of these things that are seem funny or science fiction now, I think are right around the corner. I mean, normally, you have to say, oh, what's going to happen in 50 years to get the really crazy stuff. But I think now your question of 2, 3, 5 years, that's enough time for the world to look very different.
Well, then there's the other question of the question with jobs, or whether we'll take jobs, you'd be like a job apocalypse. And in earlier changes, like from the farm to the factory, they said, well, they created more jobs in the factory than the farm. There's no problem. But the problem is the AI jobs really require training and education. And some people that are losing their job now don't have the training and education to move into the new areas. So I'm worried about the job piece in this picture.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on that. I think certainly there's the individual workers, human beings perspective that can be quite different from the economist, aggregate perspective, right? So maybe certain jobs are eliminated and certain new jobs are created, but an individual person might not be able to get that new job. So obviously that disruption of a real human cost that we shouldn't overlook. I think what's a little bit interesting, though, is this revolution, unlike prior revolutions, might actually cut the other way a little bbit. So I think about like the sewing machine. If my job is to stitch and I can do 100 stitches in a day, and then a sewing machine, can do it in a minute, suddenly I can change my job just from doing stitches, but to actually making clothes. That's the good news. Probably a more rewarding, more fun job. That said, I have to now buy a sewing machine, learn how to use it, and I think previously the jobs got more technical. First it was like, I know how to use Microsoft Word, I'm cool. Now it's like, you don't know how to use Microsoft Word? No job for you, right? So I think that the bar has gotten higher and higher for technical knowledge. What's interesting is that AI, even though under the hood it's the highest tech possible, it actually enables you to get computers to do things for you just by like typing in English.
Right. So it's low code and no code, and the voice interface. I see what you're saying. Right.
Yeah, so it's a weird thing where like to be able to make a new AI algorithm might require a PhD in computer science, but to get the new AI algorithm to help you be better as a writer, as a lawyer, as an accountant, whatever the job is, actually it may be extremely easy if you're willing to just retrain your brain to not do everything yourself and to instead invoke the assistance of this new power.
Right. That is fascinating. Aaron, I think you said it. It's going to be a super interesting sector to follow, and who knows what's really going to happen. I like your predictions, though. I hope you come back and talk with us again sometime. It's a really, really good time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I certainly don't know what's going to happen, but I'm eager to watch with you.
Great.